Well, thank you, Bill, for those kind words of welcome. It is a privilege for me to be here this morning to address this significant conference organised by the Police Foundation. So thank you, Rick, and the team, and all the hard work that's gone into organising this. So, as Bill had said, I retired from the Police Service of Northern Ireland just quite recently, end of June this year. However, I remain passionate about policing. I don't think those of us who have been in the police service as public servants in that respect can ever get it off our skin as such. And even though I'm no longer a citizen in uniform, I still care passionately about policing, and I have a keen interest in policing, and that's why it's important for me to be here this morning, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. So policing, I think, has come a long way in our understanding of trust, confidence, legitimacy over the past decade or so. There's been lots of good work done in partnership with academia, lots of quality research in getting a better understanding of how we can maintain and build legitimacy. The Police Foundation and others, of course, have been critical, right at the heart of enabling practitioners at all levels of policing to better understand the place and the importance of building legitimacy, the adoption of evidence-based practice. The drivers of confidence, for example, are just two examples amongst many that have come out of research and academia, much of it coordinated by the Police Foundation. So my task this morning is not to give a history or a resume of that journey, but rather to share with you some reflections as a recently retired Chief Constable, and hopefully from a practical perspective. I concede that it's also a Northern Ireland perspective, but I spent most of my time as Chief in Northern Ireland challenging an often held view that things are very different over there. Nonsense. There are some differences, of course, but when it comes to building legitimacy, building trust and confidence, there are many more similarities than there are differences. Also, this is a personal reflection. This is quite cathartic for me. It's a personal reflection, an analysis, if you like, from one who is no longer constrained by the office of Chief Constable. I'm not speaking on behalf of National Police Chiefs Council. I don't bless them, they're a wonderful bunch. So what I'm saying is a personal offering, and I think that sometimes when one gets to this stage and having had a few months of reflection, that can bring some value. You may not agree with all that I'm saying, you may not agree with any of it, that's okay. Disagreement and difference can be healthy, especially as we try to tease out a way forward in terms of the police relationship with the public. At the heart of our considerations for this conference, we're exploring what the public want from the police and how the police service can respond to meeting changing public expectations. And when I thought about an answer to that question, I went into a bit of a rabbit hole because I came up with more questions rather than answers, such as what is the role of neighbourhood policing in meeting these expectations and engaging with communities? How can the police secure the trust and confidence of an increasingly diverse society? Rick mentioned this. What are the implications for service delivery given the expectations of an increasingly tech-savvy citizen? So in considering these three questions of essentially how to maintain and build trust, confidence, legitimacy, I'm taken back to that well-known seventh Pelian principle of 1829. So there's nothing new under the sun. And that, of course, is that the public are the police and the police are the public. So I want to take a few minutes this morning to identify some key issues under three unsurprising, uncreative headings, because I'm stealing them from 1829. I want to look at some key issues for the public, some key issues for the police, and what I'm calling some key issues concerning the politics. And by that I'm really getting into the accountability space, because I think that's critical to what we're doing. So 3 Ps. I could almost be an Irish Presbyterian minister, fixated with alliteration and loving the 3 Ps and all of that. So the sort of broad structure is going to be the public, the police and the politics. So regarding the public, first of all, it's a bit of a misnomer, I suggest, to talk about the public in such a generic term. We use across policing, across academia, the terms like the public or the community with the assumption that the public or community are some sort of homogenous group. Clearly they are not. The public, our communities, are more diverse now than they have ever been. So understanding, respecting, acknowledging, reacting to, in an appropriate way to that diversity is what is rightly expected of policing if it is to operate with trust and legitimacy. I know it's almost stating the obvious, but sometimes I think policing has missed that point. So that first and I think most important key issue in building trust and legitimacy is to react positively to the diversity that is the public that the police are called upon to serve. I'll return to this point later when I address the issue and challenges regarding the police service itself. And of course, linked to this point is one of how representative the police service is of the communities that it serves. Another, what I think is a key observation, is what is this sort of this difference between what the public are interested in, and it's not always consistent with what policing would say is in the public interest. And I know Rick and others have done some work on this, and I imagine it will come out in the recent research that is going to be presented later. But generally, the public, and there I go using this generic term of this homogenous group, which is not homogenous, but just go with me. Generally, the public take reassurance from that old model, but still relevant, I think, of a highly visible uniformed police presence. That is not generally based on any rational analysis of threat, risk, harm, vulnerability. And why should it be? The public, the average citizen, does not have access to police intelligence or analysis of threat, risk, harm and vulnerability. So why should they base their desires, their needs, their requirements on it? Because it's not information they have available. And so my point here is that perhaps we need to be more transparent and empower communities, empower the citizen by the police taking a less risk-averse approach to publicising data, intelligence and analysis that are available internally within policing. Of course, that needs to apply within the good, sensible parameters of source protection and protection methodology and not undermining any ongoing criminal proceedings. To develop this point further, there's a balance to be struck, of course, between visible and less visible manifestations of police resources. Our understanding of demand within policing is better than it has ever been. We still have a way to go, but an improvement that has been brought about in around the last 7 to 10 years, stimulated by academic research again, driven home into policing by HMIC, FRS inspections and reports. So this proliferation of our improved understanding of vulnerability and demand has pointed us towards more resources to specifically tackle vulnerability, things like cyber-based crime, domestic abuse, serious sexual offending, countering terrorism, tackling organised crime. The problem, I think, with this more intelligent and efficient use of resource is that it actually takes resources off the high street and out of the housing estates towards less visible places. For example, we've got more people employed in cybercrime centres and sexual assault referral centres. in covert policing aimed at reducing harm caused and risk caused by serious criminality, terrorism, organised crime. And I think this is about balance. This isn't doing one or other, or the pendulum swinging the way it normally does in policing, but it's actually about us being mindful of all of this to try to strike some balance and have some good thinking around it. And this is linked to my final consideration on key issues from a public perspective. I suggest that police legitimacy is maintained and increased through that visible local presence. So this is a development of the previous point about us needing to be careful that we don't follow the analysis so far that we end up swinging in a direction away from the benefits that come from visible policing. The fundamentals of neighbourhood policing have been under the cosh in many places due to reduced police numbers brought about by austerity over the last decade. And that problem is that neighbourhood policing under the cosh is actually the place where hearts are won, where we purchase our licence to operate to do some of the more difficult stuff. I will come back to that point. This is about reassuring the citizen, but it's about more than just a woolly, fluffy, nebulous reassurance. It's actually about engagement, building relationships, solving problems with communities, empowering communities, and ensuring that two-way flow of information so that there's a better understanding between the public and the police. This connection and engagement provides this license to operate when we have to apply more hard-edge, more difficult, intrusive tactics like those required in countering terrorism or tackling serious organised crime. The promised increase that we've heard recently in relation to police officer numbers to take us back to somewhere close to where we were before austerity may assist in squaring this circle of balancing resources between the visible and the less visible parts of current day policing and demand. The challenges and dilemmas, I suggest, are too complex to simply throw money at increasing police numbers back and taking police numbers back to operating models that existed pre-austerity. So Plato said that necessity is the mother, and we would say, of course, or father of invention or of innovation. Therefore, it's important for policing, I think, to use the lessons that have been learned, the evidence that has been gained around managing demand and vulnerability to ensure that the increased investment in policing is used to build the appropriate capabilities to improve service and therefore build trust and legitimacy. So overlapping with that and connected to it takes me to my second bucket of key issues, and that's from a police perspective. For the police organisation itself, there are four key issues that I want to offer. There are many more than four, of course, but time is limited and this clock's ticking away in front of me, and I want to leave a few minutes for you to challenge me at the end. So, but the four issues that I'm offering you this morning around building trust and legitimacy is, number one, representativeness, a hard nut that has not been cracked in British policing in the last 40, 50 years. Representatives, number one. Two, building 21st century capabilities. Three, police connection with the citizen, perhaps linked to some of the visibility stuff. And fourthly, resilience. That is internal officer resilience, well-being, good mental health. And I'll explain why I think that's important, but essentially it's about the police looking after themselves so that they can look after the citizen. I've already mentioned the diversity that exists in the people group we describe as the public or the community. And at its core, the Pelian truism that I mentioned at the outset that the police are the public and the public are the police. That's central to, it should be central to police thinking, to police culture. If that principle is accepted, then how can we function properly if we are not representative of the communities that we serve? There are two aspects to this. Firstly, it's simply the right and ethical aspiration to have if the diverse public are to put their trust and confidence in a police service. But secondly, and perhaps more selfishly, if the police service is made up of the collective experience, outlook, ethnicity, culture, religion, and political kaleidoscope that is our diverse communities, then we're more likely to have a diverse, community-focused approach to how we deliver services. It will be a healthier culture. It'll be a better way of operating that should be evident in everything that the police do, from setting strategy to planning operations to frontline service delivery and engagement. In Northern Ireland, part of the police reforms introduced following the Patton report was I think quite radical. I was going to say for its time. I think even of this time it's quite radical because it's a bit of a taboo in some political and policing circles. But for a time-bound period of time, legislative change was brought about to tackle underrepresentation, in our case on the basis of religion, but this could apply to race, to ethnicity, to other protected categories. The Catholic community within Northern Ireland was, and still is, in around 50%, about 48-49% of the population. But for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to explore today, and there's validity with all of the reasons, even if they're competing, but for a variety of reasons, the police service had only 8% of its officers from the Catholic community. So for a period of 10 years, from 2002 to 2012, legislation was enforced to enable 50-50 recruitment. What do I mean by that? Well, it's this. All successful applicants who had achieved the required standard, so that's a very important prerequisite in this project, but all who had achieved the required standard for recruitment were placed in a Catholic pool or a non-Catholic pool, and 50% drawn from each pool to make up each intake of new officers into police training. This significant step, of course, attracted criticism and something of a backlash from the overrepresented Protestant or Unionist community and politicians, but it was absolutely, strategically, the right thing to do to address underrepresentation that would otherwise have taken many decades and generations to rectify. Patton identified that bringing the Catholic representation to a critical mass of around 30% would be the desired outcome to create the momentum and change the makeup of the organisation for the better in pursuit of this legitimacy through appropriate representation, a more representative workforce. Today, the Police Service of Northern Ireland recruitment has reverted to normal selection and recruitment protocols. And while work continues in this regard, and one could never become complacent around this, but the Catholic population of the police service today sits at just over 33%, in excess of that critical mass that Patton had recommended. This was a controversial measure, to say the least, but it was absolutely necessary to address the imbalance. Fundamentally, this was a political decision, but it seems to me that similar measures should be considered by the government to address the underrepresentation of black and minority ethnic communities in the police service in Great Britain. The leadership of the police service should, in my opinion, remain neutral in such controversial issues of a political nature, but nor should police leadership be so averse to such measures for a time-bound period to address with positive impact the problem that has proven intractable since the Scarman report of 1981, and perhaps before that, but certainly Scarman identifies this issue. I believe the government has a responsibility to consider measures that could enable the police service within the United Kingdom to be more representative of the communities that the police serve. Secondly, then, as UK policing looks to some improved funding, it's critical that there is innovation and agility displayed regarding how the additional monies are spent. Of course, the majority of the funding should be will need to be spent on filling gaps, on human resource and increasing police numbers. But the last decade has taught us that the key is building better capabilities rather than simply bolstering numbers, especially when we're bolstering numbers into operating models that have, by necessity and improvement, moved on over the past decade or so. It's not all about boots on the ground, important though boots on the ground are. We need officers and staff who are equipped and empowered through everything from mobile technology, body-worn video, digital skills, cyber skills, to be more effective, to reduce bureaucracy, to stop double keying, all of that by building capabilities. And capability building is not the same as capacity building. It's not the same as hard numbers of staff. And I'm not being naive. I accept that the vast majority of the 20,000 officers worth will need to be spent on officers. It just seems to me that we should be careful to benefit from the lessons that have been learned in the last decade or so. And what does that look like? About being different, about being innovative, about being agile? Well, I offer direct entry specialists to address things like cyber, vulnerability, serious organised crime, and certain aspects of terrorism may be more appropriate. I'm not convinced that police selection and recruitment practices fully meet that need efficiently and effectively. It is welcomed, but it's too easy and too simplistic to address the needs of policing with a headline of an additional 20,000 additional officers for England and Wales. In my view, national police leadership should be informing and influencing this increased funding to invest in policing through new and innovative ways of building police capabilities rather than overly simplistically increasing the police headcount in the same manner as we have selected and recruited for several generations. I think there's lots of movement in the right direction on this. The Police Education Qualifications Framework goes some way to addressing this. However, it still assumes recruitment of generalists when some innovation regarding diversity and recruitment of some specialists is required to efficiently address the ever-increasing complexity of police demand. Direct entry detectives here in London is another sign of movement, I think, in the right direction. But it seems to me that a more radical, agile and considered approach to recruiting and selection would be beneficial to building a better service and therefore police effectiveness and ultimately legitimacy. My third issue for policing that I offer you to consider and to take apart this morning is that we've already considered the challenges of meeting public expectations regarding visibility of police when many of the current demands in tackling risk and vulnerability together with reduced levels of officer numbers take us away from deployments in the most visible places. A balance needs to be struck in managing those competing demands. However, I suggest that connectivity is more critical than visibility. The public, again, generally the public, want to feel connected to their police. Traditionally, that was enabled through actual visibility of bobbies on the beat. And there's still a place for that, and there will be a place for that into the future. However, a number of changes in how us citizens, us the public, live our lives along with changing and more complex demands and lower resourcing levels, means that other ways of connecting public and police require further development. Increasingly, tech-savvy citizens carry out much of their life's activities and engagements online, on social media, and secure much of their services and their shopping digitally. Policing has made huge strides in this area. For example, in the Police Service of Northern Ireland, there are over 1.2 million followers across their social media platforms, and I know that most forces are well engaged in this space. And the various social media awards events give us great stories and examples, actually, of really effective use of social media platforms. The work being led through NPCC Digital Policing Programme in the various strands of connecting the police with the public, and we'll hear, I think, about that from Rachel later. There's also the digital intelligence and investigation strand, and there's a digital first reform of the criminal justice system. It should actually encourage us that there is progress being made and that there's movement in the right direction. However, to meet new and future expectations, I think more needs to be done and needs to be done faster. This is a good example of policing needing to apply resources to build the appropriate capabilities fit for the current and future needs of the citizen. My observation, having had a few months to reflect, is that if we were in the private sector and citizen engagement was a function of financial turnover or profit margins, we would have moved further and faster towards digital engagement and delivery of services digitally. And I say that in full knowledge of the good work that is going on all over policing in developing capabilities in this regard. For example, the single online home project being led by Simon Cole on the Digital Contact Programme Board offers over 40 transactional services online. More evidence that we are moving in the right direction. But this comes back to the money, building capabilities, how we use the money. The fact that the home project rollout is dependent on annual support from police transformational funding means that even though I think every force has signed up to this move, only 12 are down the path of implementation, and I don't think anybody has got to full implementation yet. So my final issue for the police service itself is quite internally focused, but it's important for building trust and legitimacy because it is a function of, it depends on service delivery, or service delivery depends on this through individual and organisational behaviour. This is about officer and staff personal resilience, mental health, and their well-being. The people who make up the police service are by any measure the most valuable asset of the policing organisation. Policing is more challenging than ever. Demand is more complex. Dealing with mental health issues in public service is more prevalent than ever. And officers and staff are exposed to more trauma than ever. The impact of all of these additional growing stressors on officers and staff is exacerbated by the reduced numbers and the lack of investment in policing that I've already mentioned over the past decade. Addressing resilience, mental health and well-being is well acknowledged within the police service. It's the right thing to do. It's ethical leadership, and I pay great tribute to the fantastic work that's going on, nationally led by Andy Rhodes, but replicated and adopted across most forces. And I was just reading last week about Hampshire and the work that Olivia is doing around psychological profiling, not in an intrusive way, but in a supportive way to help officers build their personal resilience and deal with well-being. It is right that we consider and assess this as part of the internal legitimacy work within Peel, and I suggest that this is also a service delivery issue and therefore can impact on our legitimacy with the citizen. Anecdotally, as Chief, I saw many misconduct issues and complaints that I have no doubt had their root cause in the resilience levels and the mental health of the officers concerned. Now, that proposition is not an excuse for poor behaviour or unethical conduct or misconduct of any shape, but at a strategic level, policing needs to realise that we have to look after ourselves if we're going to be effective in looking after the public. We should not be surprised that when individual officers are under pressure and are not enjoying strong levels of personal resilience, they are more likely to exercise poor judgment. They may react to a member of the public in a way that they're not proud of and that they wouldn't ordinarily do, or they may dip below the levels of professionalism expected. So I'm offering that well-being, mental health, personal resilience is actually an enabler to building good confidence and trust and therefore legitimacy between police and public. Finally, the politics. I'm not sure if this really is politics or it was just my desire to have 3 Ps, but bear with me anyway. There's small p political issues. I'm not going to be advocating for any particular party, given that we're in this period of purdah and so on, but it seems to me that the impact, that this has a significant impact on how policing positions itself and how it's viewed by wider public society community. I want to address 2 interconnected points that seem to me very important in helping to maintain or enhance the legitimacy of the police service. These are the concepts of operational independence and accountability. Now, they overlap and they're interconnected, but bear with me for a few minutes while I explain what I mean. Understandably, the concept of operational independence has been preciously guarded by policing over many generations. Some would say that the concept is more in jeopardy now than it has ever been. The legislative basis on which police and crime commissioners operate, the consequence of a single elected person within certain parameters, empowered to hire and fire chief constables, act as appropriate authority for the chiefs, set police and crime plans, and hold the chief to account in a very public way, has created an impression in some quarters that the operational independence of the police has been eroded. That's an observation. I'm not advocating that position. I'm saying that I've heard those conversations. I've heard that perspective. The same potential, of course, exists in relation to other statutory oversight, accountability bodies, like, in my case, it was a 19-person policing board, but some would have said they were all saw themselves as policing experts and happy to tell me what to do. But with respect to some of my former Chief Constable colleagues, I think there's sometimes a confusion within senior police leadership between public accountability and operational independence. The Patton report introduced a new, it was 20 years ago now, but it was new at the time, and I think a very helpful and more accurate term by replacing operational independence with operational responsibility. What does that mean? In essence, this means that policing should be empowered to take operational decisions from a professional policing perspective, but that in taking decisions and actions, we should be ready to explain, justify, and defend them after the fact. It is inappropriate for oversight bodies or politicians to be directing operational policing. That goes without saying. Operational policing decisions or actions, or even not to do certain things. But it is entirely appropriate for the police to be held to account and to be answerable for the operational decisions that have been taken. That answerability builds and maintains police legitimacy. I offer you the principle of operational responsibility as a better, more nuanced and more accurate term than operational independence. So overlapping and connected with this operational responsibility, if you allow me to call it that, is the broader police approach to accountability. There are both formal and informal mechanisms for accountability. Formal accountability includes oversight bodies such as PCCs, policing boards, police authorities, and so on, created in statute and therefore with a legitimate power to hold the police to account. Likewise, there are accountability arrangements, perhaps less direct, with sponsoring government departments on various issues, either centrally into Whitehall or into the devolved administrations. I suggest that accountability arrangements working effectively can promote legitimacy in policing. The public can take confidence and assurance from the fact that their police service is fully answerable under the law to such oversight bodies. And I think my earlier comments in relation to operational responsibility provides a healthy and constructive approach to managing that accountability relationship. Formal accountability also exists with such bodies as the IOPC and the Police Ombudsman in the case of Northern Ireland. Again, these bodies are empowered by the will of Parliament through legislation. Now, being investigated and being held to account in a public manner is rarely comfortable or easy. Sometimes the judgments and the public commentary, the conclusions from these accountability bodies is even disagreeable or apparently unfair. And when there is legitimate disagreement on the conclusions of IOPC investigations, for example, of course policing should have a right to reply. However, my observation is that it may appear to the public that the predominant commentary from policing on the findings of the work of these accountability bodies is one of resistance or defensiveness. While I would always advocate for the right of reply for police, I think it helps build confidence in policing when the police are explicit in welcoming accountability generally and are seen to be explicit in embracing accountability. I believe that shows a humility. It reinforces the public service ethos and assures the community that police want to operate in a manner that the police can be proud of and the public can have confidence in. This concept of embracing accountability also extends to informal accountability through media, community meetings and local engagements. Being answerable, explaining police actions before being asked, proactively explaining and justifying actions or inactions has to be healthy for developing confidence and legitimacy. So I bring my remarks to a conclusion, but before I do so, because I think I've covered a lot of ground. It may not be rich ground, it may not be enjoyable ground, it might have been stating the obvious, but I just want to quickly bullet point, very quickly, 10 sentences of the sort of key points that I'm making. First, the public are not homogenous. Policing needs to respect that diversity and react to that diversity. 2, transparency with police data narrows the gap between what the public are interested in and what's in the public interest. 3, there is a need for a resource balance between tactically managing demand and being accessible enough to be connected with the citizen to enable that license to operate to exist. Fourthly, effective resourcing is about building capability, not just boots on the ground, important though they are. 5th, recruitment and selection needs to be relevant to 21st century needs and specialisms. It should be more agile and responsive, linked to that building capabilities point. 6, representativeness is critical. If we haven't made the progress required, despite lots of effort, perhaps government needs to intervene with more radical measures. 7, digital and online engagement needs investment in a sustainable way to achieve the plan. Connectivity is an important supplement for visibility. Number 8, resilience, good mental health and well-being has internal and external consequences for organisational legitimacy. 9, operational independence is better described and defined as operational responsibility. 10, accountability, both formal and informal, should be embraced, even when it's uncomfortable. So I trust these observations and reflections from an old pensioner will stimulate some thought, some debate, even some disagreement from the conference. And thank you for your time today. I think